What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fantasy Trade Targets here on the Fantasy Stock Exchange. I have a few buy low, sell high guys for you, concluding week 3, ahead of week 4, I should say. And I'm just going to jump right into it. My first buy low, surprisingly enough, is going to be Deshaun Watson, quarterback for the Houston Texans. So let me start off by saying I'm not usually one to go out of my way and trade for quarterbacks in one quarterback leagues. But Deshaun Watson could be the exception. So there's no secret that he has obvious top 5 upside at the position. I mean, he was drafted as such. Even with Houston losing DeAndre Hopkins, he was still highly touted this offseason. Now, the first 3 weeks for him have been less than stellar. He put up over 20 fantasy points in week 1, but week 2 and week 3, he's kind of fell short of expectations. But you can't really fault him too much because he had Kansas City, he had Baltimore, and then he had Pittsburgh. So it's like you combine all 3 of those, plus he's getting used to an offense without DeAndre Hopkins after not having really any practice or training camp without DeAndre Hopkins. I think Deshaun Watson is going to be perfectly fine. He still looks good. He still has that rushing upside, and the schedule does get a lot easier for him down the road. I mean, it's almost impossible for it not to be easier after those first 3 weeks. But between now and week 13, that schedule is very light, even in the fantasy playoffs on deck. I know we're talking about weeks 14 through 16 already, but you always want to be thinking about this. On deck, he's going to have Chicago, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati. And while I'd say the 3 of them are probably better than average in terms of keeping the quarterback under wraps for fantasy right now, it's still not bad, especially when it's a talent such as Deshaun Watson. So I'm going to go out of my way, and I'm going to try to buy low on him right now. You know, I'm not sending an RB1 or a high-end wide receiver 2 or something like that to get Deshaun Watson because I don't believe in having an elite fantasy quarterback that much. But if you can get him at a discount after these first 3 weeks, I 1,000% would because, again, there's obvious top 5 potential with him week in and week out, and his schedule is going to get a hell of a lot easier moving forward. So moving on to my first sell high of the day, and it's actually going to be Devin Singletary. So in week 3, Devin Singletary had 121 scrimmage yards on 13 attempts and 4 catches. I believe he was targeted 5 times. But if you'll notice, this number was higher than the first 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks, he accumulated, I think, 9.5 and 10.5 fantasy points. And then week 3, he completely, I don't want to say completely busted out, but he turned that up to about 16.5 fantasy points. Now, the reason for this was that Zach Moss wasn't playing in week 3, which, to be honest, was kind of quiet news. I feel like a lot of people that don't have Zach Moss on their team or don't have Devin Singletary already on their team, I feel like they didn't really pay attention to that news because it's not world-breaking news. But as I record this today, Wednesday, September 30th, Zach Moss is already back at practice. He's going back, and as soon as he returns to the lineup, Devin Singletary is going from his 16-point week 3 down to probably just a weekly floor play of that 9 to 11 PPR points. So much like I was saying about Mark Ingram last week, Devin Singletary had a really good 2019, but because of competition on the roster, the 2020 is just probably not going to be there. So with Devin Singletary, after putting up 16 points last week, I'd try to deal him if I could. There are a lot of people that have lost running backs over the last couple of weeks to injuries, and if you happen to be one of the lucky few that has both Devin Singletary and some other roster depth somewhere else, I would definitely see what I could get for Devin Singletary because I think we're going to see a lot more 10-point games than we are going to see these 16-point games. So Devin Singletary is a great sell high target for the week. Moving on to my next buy low, it's Chris Godwin. I know this is a little surprising, especially since he's slated to miss this week and week 5, but that's just all the more reason to go out and buy him low. People are so turned off of Chris Godwin right now because he got hurt in week 1 and then didn't play week 2. He played pretty much all of week 3 except for the last few minutes and then went out with injury, and now he's out for 2 more games. So he'll be missing 3 of his first 5 games, and he was at least somewhat limited in the other 2 because of the injuries that he sustained. But so far, Chris Godwin has shown a really good rapport with Tom Brady. Chris Godwin is really picking up right where he left off last year. He's looking like a phenomenal receiver out there. He's looking like Brady's favorite target. Maybe that's Scotty Miller, But Chris Godwin does a hell of a lot more with the ball and gets the same, if not more, targets than Scotty Miller on a weekly basis. But anyway, with Chris Godwin, he is about to have 20 full days of rest. Now, granted, he's going to return to practice following that game in week 5 and everything to get ready for week 6, but he is not going to see a game for around the next 20 days or so. Chris Godwin is absolutely an elite talent at the receiver position. He's got Tom Brady throwing in the ball. He's on a team that is supposed to be very good for the duration of 2020. I mean, there's not, aside from the injury issues, there is nothing to dislike about Chris Godwin's game. And much like I was saying about Christian McCaffrey last week, if you can deal for him at the start of his injury, you're going to completely reap the benefits once he's back in. My fingers are crossed that Chris Godwin, once he's back in week 6, he's here to stay and we're not going to see any more injuries. So I would, at the very least, I would do my due diligence and see what the Chris Godwin owner would be asking for him, because I think it's definitely worth the 2-week wait if you can kind of buy low on him. Having a superstar receiver on your roster once week 6 comes around, there's nothing like it. I mean, you could probably get him by dealing maybe a couple pieces to a desperate team right now, or maybe the guy who has Chris Godwin in your league is currently sitting at 0-3 and just really needs to shake it up and can't afford losses these next 2 weeks without Chris Godwin. So it's all situational, but Chris Godwin is definitely one of my favorite buy low targets this week. My next sell high target today is actually going to be Darrell Henderson. So he had 120 scrimmage yards and a touchdown in week 3, but I'm still selling him. Not only is the Rams' schedule kind of miserable coming up for the running backs, but think about this committee. Cam Akers is out right now. Malcolm Brown, they said he was healthy in week 3, but he may not have been fully healthy. Either way, when Cam Akers comes back, this is going to go back to being a 3-headed monster type of backfield. All it's going to take for Darrell Henderson to lose the quote-unquote hot hand is a few bad rushes. Cam Akers comes in and does well, or Malcolm Brown comes in and does well. I mean, there's not a lot to like for the backfield out of LA right now. Darrell Henderson has back-to-back weeks scoring 20 PPR points. I would 1,000% deal while I could. Cam Akers is going to be back sooner than later. We already know Malcolm Brown can ball out, especially after that week 1 that he put out. There's really not a lot to like about Darrell Henderson for the entire season. I don't think week 2 and week 3 are going to be sustainable. I don't like their schedule, and I don't like the amount of competition that is on this roster. So to me, Darrell Henderson, after being a top waiver priority last week and after really having a strong performance again in week 3, I think you got to capitalize on these performances while he's still having them, because, again, it's only a matter of time before Cam Akers is back and this potentially turns into a 3-headed monster type of backfield again. So my last buy low of the day is going to be DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. So DJ Moore, piss poor week 1, piss poor week 3, really good week 2. But he's coming off of a down week where the Panthers didn't really need to use him. Surprisingly, Carolina was in control that entire game. Their defense stepped up. Mike Davis out of the backfield really stepped up. As a Carolina Panthers fan, I was absolutely pumped to see this. But as a DJ Moore believer in fantasy, not so much. But he is top 10 in the league right now in terms of targets, despite only having 4 targets in week 3. Then you have to factor in that Carolina is not going to be in the driver's seat in many more games this season. The fact that they didn't really need to use DJ Moore in week 3 is going to be a total oddity, because speaking as a Panthers fan, they are going to be playing catch up a lot this year. And DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, those type of guys, they will be hyper-targeted. And we saw that in week 2 when DJ Moore had 13 or 14 targets in a single game. A lot of people coming into the season thought DJ Moore was going to be this top 10, top 15 receiver, and people were absolutely amped up to be getting him in the 3rd, 4th, even 5th round of their fantasy drafts. And already people are souring on him because he had 2 bad weeks in the first 3 weeks of the season. I really think people are overreacting, and if you happen to be in a league with the guy that has DJ Moore who is overreacting, this is a perfect time to start picking his brain. I really think DJ Moore is going to come out and have a successful week against Arizona. That's a very high-octane offense. Carolina is going to have to sling the ball to keep up with them. And I think DJ Moore is going to be a massive beneficiary of it. So if you can go out and get DJ Moore, or at least make some offers prior to week 4 beginning, I think that would be very wise because, again, he is one of my favorite buy low targets, and he was one of my favorite guys to target in fantasy drafts this year. I'm not ready to give up, and you shouldn't be either. So I know last week I did 3 buy lows and 3 sell highs, but frankly, there just isn't much after week 3, with the exception of Devin Singletary and Darrell Henderson that I consider a true sell high. So I'll just end it here with some advice. So to spot a true sell high, you want to examine a player that has uncharacteristically had a big week. Recency bias is one hell of a thing when it comes to fantasy football. And if you can avoid having tunnel vision from one good week, you can really capitalize on a lot of trades during the fantasy season. So, last week I said Mark Ingram was a good time to sell high. He went out in week 2, had like 50 or 60 yards in the score. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head. But a situation like that, where the actual player's situation isn't good season long, or maybe they have a good past. So, for example, with Mark Ingram, we're living off of an RB1 season in 2019. You can kind of swing things. You can take that positive week in week 2. You can take his previous status as a top dog in the league. You can put that all together and try to sell high on a guy. I'm not saying that you have to sell high. Just because a guy scores high, that it might seem like an hour, doesn't mean you have to sell high. If it's a guy that could go on a hot streak or is looming a potential breakout, those are guys you want to hold on to. But the guys that have had, the guys like, I know I'm going back to last week, but even Odell Beckham Jr., who were really just kind of living off of his name at this point. He's another one of those guys. He had a solid week in week 2. If you could have sold him after that, it would have been the perfect time to do it, because he kind of reminded everyone like, hey, I'm still here. But if you're a smart fantasy owner, you realize that, well, OBJ really hasn't been here for the last 1 to 2 seasons, and you should probably sell him if you could. So I guess that's my biggest advice for this week is when you're trying to figure out if you want to sell high on a player, you got to examine a whole bunch of things, but there's no better time to do it than coming off of a big week, which is why Devin Singletary and Darrell Henderson are leading that list for me this week. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I got for you here today. If you're not subscribed already, feel free to hit that subscribe button down below. Follow me on Twitter at @FF_Mikey10. Feel free to follow the Fantasy Stock Exchange over on Twitter as well. And I will see you guys again next week for Fantasy Trade Targets. Hopefully we have some more sell highs to go off of.